It was rough. Musicians union was there, but they weren't of much help at the time. I was never happy. I guess what drives me um, to tear things apart.
There are musicians who achieve fame, and then there are musicians who rewrite the rules entirely. Eddie Van Halen was the second kind. From the moment Eruption crackled out of speakers in 1978, the guitar world split cleanly into two eras, before Eddie, and after. He was the shy kid from Pasadena who built his own guitars, rewired his own amplifiers, and invented sounds that nobody had ever heard before. He was generous with fans, childlike in his enthusiasm, and almost disarmingly humble for someone who had single-handedly revolutionized an instrument. But beneath all of that warmth ran a current of complicated feeling, admiration curdling into disappointment, inspiration twisting into rivalry, and hero worship colliding with the hard reality that legends are just human beings holding guitars. By the time Eddie reached his early 60s, he had lived long enough to speak frankly about those tensions, and what emerged was a portrait of a man who loved music so completely that he could never quite forgive those who he felt had failed it, or failed him. These are the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen carried complicated feelings about, ranging from quiet heartbreak to outright fury. Before anyone in America knew the name Van Halen, a teenage Eddie was sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor in Pasadena, a stack of Cream albums beside him and a second-hand guitar in his lap. Night after night, he lowered the needle onto Crossroads and tried to decode what Eric Clapton was doing. He told Guitar World in an interview that Clapton was his main influence, that he spent hours trying to figure out every bend, every pause, every moment of sustain. To the teenage Eddie, Clapton wasn't just a guitarist. He was a god. That reverence shaped everything. The way Eddie learned to phrase a note, to let silence speak as loudly as sound, to make a guitar feel like something alive rather than something mechanical, all of it traced back to those hours with Clapton's records. When Eddie finally arrived on the national stage with Van Halen's debut album, he carried Clapton's DNA inside his playing, even if nobody could hear it underneath the fireworks. The hurt came in 1980. Clapton, asked about the Van Halen phenomenon, delivered a response that Eddie would carry for years. Clapton said that Eddie was technically very good but that he didn't hear much soul in the playing. It was casual, almost offhand, the kind of thing a musician says in an interview without fully understanding the weight it carries. But for Eddie, it was devastating. He later said that it kind of broke his heart, that he had learned everything from Clapton, that he hadn't been trying to outplay him but had simply been inspired by him. Hearing that his hero didn't connect with what he was doing genuinely wounded him. What made the comment sting so deeply was the philosophical divide it revealed. Clapton's guitar work was rooted in the blues tradition, in restraint and economy, where every note earned its place. Eddie's playing was something entirely different, explosive and free, governed by instinct rather than tradition. They weren't just from different generations. They were from different musical universes. Eddie eventually made his peace with that, telling Guitar World in 2001 that if Clapton hadn't existed, neither would he, and that whatever Clapton thought of his playing couldn't change that fundamental truth. The admiration never left. It simply matured. If Eric Clapton represented Eddie's soulful heartbreak, Ritchie Blackmore represented something colder and more direct. As a teenager, Eddie studied Deep Purple obsessively. He played Highway Star and Burn until his fingers hurt, trying to absorb the precision and drama of Blackmore's solos. There was something about the way Blackmore approached the guitar with a kind of theatrical menace, like every note carried a consequence, that captivated the young Eddie completely. When Van Halen's debut album exploded in 1978 and Eddie suddenly found himself standing beside the musicians he had idolized, he hoped for some acknowledgement, some small sign that the men who had inspired him recognized what he was doing. What he got from Blackmore was a blank stare. In a 1982 Guitar Player interview with writer Jas Obrecht, Eddie recalled meeting Blackmore and being completely frozen out. Blackmore just stared at him, wouldn't say hello, wouldn't offer any warmth at all. Eddie said he was crushed, that he had looked up to this man his entire life and had simply been ignored. He mentioned it again in another interview, telling Rock and Roll Garage that people like Ritchie Blackmore just gave him the shaft with their eyes, that they wouldn't say hello or be nice, and that he wasn't that way himself. That phrase, "The shaft with their eyes," is one of the most vivid descriptions Eddie ever offered of how the old guard treated the new. When Blackmore was eventually asked about Van Halen years later, he offered something that sounded like a compliment wrapped around an insult, saying Eddie was a fine player but that he played too many notes. Coming from a man whose own solos were architectural monuments to note selection, it was a pointed critique and probably a defensive one. In a 1995 Guitar World interview, Eddie reflected on the encounter with more generosity, suggesting he had perhaps been too sensitive and allowing that Blackmore might have simply been shy. Blackmore, for his part, eventually softened. In a 2008 Classic Rock magazine interview, he acknowledged that Eddie had brought something genuinely new to the instrument and that what he did with the whammy bar and tapping technique was clever and distinctive. It was a late and partial reconciliation, but it was something. The late 1970s were a generational earthquake in rock music, and nobody felt the tremors more acutely than the players who had established themselves in the years before Van Halen arrived. Joe Perry of Aerosmith was one of those players, a cornerstone of American hard rock built on swagger, riff-heavy grooves, and raw attitude. When the Van Halen debut hit and Eddie's playing began redefining what the electric guitar could do, the contrast with the existing order couldn't have been sharper. In that same 1982 Guitar Player interview with Jazz Obrecht, Eddie described what it felt like to be on tour in those early years and to bump into the musicians whose posters had hung on his bedroom wall. He said that people like Joe Perry would just give him the shaft with their eyes, that they wouldn't say hello or make any effort to be decent. He wasn't asking for mentorship or special treatment. He just wanted a handshake, a basic acknowledgement from one musician to another. What he got instead was cold indifference. Eddie believed that Perry and others like him felt threatened. He said as much in that interview, suggesting that those established players wouldn't go out of their way to help anyone because they felt their position was in danger. It was a pointed observation, and probably an accurate one. Eddie's style, rooted in invention rather than tradition, with two-handed tapping and harmonic complexity that seemed to come from another dimension, was genuinely unsettling to musicians who had spent years mastering a different vocabulary. What makes the Perry story particularly interesting is how completely it reversed itself over time. In a 2013 interview covered by Van Halen News Desk, Perry spoke about hearing Van Halen's debut album for the first time with open amazement. He said he was completely blown away, that he kept going back to try to figure out the techniques and the energy, and that Eddie had reinvented guitar playing. He described Eddie's playing as phenomenal and said that Eddie had taken everything he heard and put his own stamp on it. Eddie had long stopped seeking that approval by the time it arrived. But the fact that it came at all said everything about the size of his legacy. The tension between Eddie Van Halen and Tom Scholz of Boston was less about personality and more about philosophy, though the story that ignited it was vivid enough. Sometime in the late 1970s, Van Halen and Boston shared a bill, and Eddie performed his solo during the Van Halen set. When Scholz took the stage, he proceeded to play what sounded to Eddie like his solo, note for note, right in front of the same crowd. Eddie recalled the incident years later with a mixture of disbelief and genuine irritation. He said he was standing on stage while the whole crowd looked at him, and he was furious. The episode was compounded by Scholz's personality, which couldn't have been more different from Eddie's. Where Eddie was open and warm, laughing easily, swapping gear talk with anyone who would listen, Scholz was famously private and withdrawn. He had an MIT master's degree in mechanical engineering and had built Boston's debut album in a basement studio he engineered himself. He also invented the Rockman amp system, which became one of the defining sounds of arena rock. He was a genuine genius of a very particular kind, methodical, precise, and almost allergic to the social rituals that musicians like Eddie found natural. Eddie hinted at his frustration in a 1980 Guitar Player interview, talking about players who were already trying to copy his tapping and his runs. He didn't name Scholz directly, but the message was clear enough. For Eddie, originality wasn't a preference. It was sacred. He had built his Frankenstrat by hand, soldering his own pickups and experimenting until he found sounds nobody else had. The idea that someone would simply mirror those sounds without bringing anything new to them was deeply offensive to his sense of what music was supposed to be about. He once said that there's a difference between inspiration and duplication, that everyone starts by being inspired by someone else, but that if you don't evolve, you're just tracing someone else's shadow. That line captures exactly why Scholes bothered him. Mutual respect did eventually surface. Scholes acknowledged that Eddie had genuine imagination, which he said couldn't be taught. Eddie returned the gesture years later, saying he respected anyone who got their hands dirty building their own gear. It was the closest two men from entirely different musical planets could come to a handshake. The Rick Derringer episode is one of the most revealing stories in Eddie Van Halen's career, not because of how it started but because of how directly Eddie handled it. It was 1978, and Van Halen was on fire. The debut album was out and changing everything. Derringer, a veteran player with genuine history and real credibility, was opening for them on a run of dates. Eddie respected him and had grown up listening to his work. That respect made what happened next considerably more painful. After a show, Eddie found Derringer and confronted him directly. He told him that he had grown up on his playing and admired him enormously, but that he couldn't use Eddie's melody. He made clear that he wasn't objecting to Derringer using the technique of tapping, which was spreading rapidly through the guitar world. What he objected to was Derringer playing his solo, note for note and phrase for phrase, in front of the same audience. The distinction mattered enormously to Eddie. Inspiration was legitimate. Replication was theft. The next night, Derringer did it again. Same notes, same phrasing, and he closed his set with "You Really Got Me," a song Van Halen had already made their own signature live moment. Eddie's patience ran out completely. He told Derringer plainly that if he was going to keep doing that, he wasn't going to keep opening for them. And Derringer was removed from the tour. Years later, Eddie admitted with some irony that he had copied some of Derringer's chops himself back in the early days. The sting came not from imitation itself, which he understood as part of how music works, but from watching a player he respected cross the line from inspiration into exact duplication. His father, Jan Van Halen, had taught him early that if you play someone else's song, you make it your own. Eddie lived by that principle absolutely. Every cover Van Halen recorded was transformed into something that felt native to them. Hearing someone treat his own original work the same way he treated borrowed material felt like a violation at the deepest level. Derringer never publicly addressed the full story. When asked about Eddie in later years, he simply said that nobody could touch him as a player. Perhaps that was his version of an apology. The most complicated relationship on this list is the one with Randy Rhoads, because it contains almost none of the clean emotional lines that define the others. This wasn't a case of a hero being dismissive or a contemporary being imitative. This was something more unsettling, two young guitar revolutionaries looking at each other across the center of rock's most competitive era and seeing both a rival and a mirror. Archive audio captured in the documentary Randy Rhoads, Reflections of a Guitar Icon preserves Eddie reflecting on Rhoads during the period when comparisons between the two were constant and relentless. His words were layered in ways that he probably didn't fully intend to reveal. He said that Rhoads was honest, at least, because he acknowledged that everything he did he learned from Eddie. He said Rhoads was good but that he didn't think Rhoads had done anything Eddie hadn't already done. Then he added, almost immediately, that there was nothing wrong with it, that he had copied other people too. That sequence is classic Eddie, simultaneously claiming priority and generosity, defending his territory while trying to appear above the conflict. Ozzy Osbourne, who worked with Rhoads more closely than almost anyone, pushed back hard on Eddie's framing. Speaking to Rolling Stone, Ozzy said he had heard that Eddie claimed to have taught Randy all his licks, and called it simply untrue. He said that Randy didn't have particularly kind things to say about Eddie either, and described them plainly as rivals. There's even a story that Rhoads' guitar technician taped a photograph of Eddie Van Halen to the underside of Randy's wah pedal, so that every time he pressed down on it during a performance, he was literally standing on Eddie's face. Whether it was intended as humor or as something sharper, the gesture reveals the intensity of the competition and how much each man's presence weighed on the other. What makes the Rhoads chapter genuinely tragic is that the rivalry never had the chance to evolve. Randy Rhoads died in a plane crash in March 1982 at 25 years old, and with him went whatever reconciliation or mature mutual recognition might have eventually emerged. Eddie was left holding feelings he could never fully resolve, because the other person wasn't there to complete the conversation. In later years, when Eddie mentioned Rhoads at all, the defensiveness had faded and been replaced by something quieter and more complicated. Perhaps he understood, as he got older, that the intensity of the rivalry had always been a form of recognition, that you only feel genuinely threatened by someone who is genuinely extraordinary. At 62, Eddie Van Halen had lived long enough to see most of his rivalries transform. Heroes who dismissed him had come to acknowledge what he built. Peers who copied him had eventually found their own voices. And the complicated feelings he carried about Randy Rhoads had softened into something closer to respect for a talent that burned too briefly and too brilliantly to ever be fully resolved. What remained, underneath all of it, was the guitar, which Eddie had always loved more than any rivalry, more than any approval, and more than anything else in the world.